This podcast represents the opinions of our hosts and their guests only. The content here should not be taken as medical advice and is for informational purposes only. And because each person is so unique, please consult your healthcare professional for any medical questions. Welcome to Once Shattered, Picking Up the Pieces, a podcast devoted to changing the way eating disorders and mental illness are viewed in our society. With your hosts, Jack and Linda Major and Ellen Bennett. Today's guest is Renée Schuls-Jacobson. When a trusted physician tells Renée Schuls-Jacobson that he has the solution for her chronic insomnia, a tried and true medication without any side effects, she believes him. For 7 years, she takes clonazepam, exactly as prescribed, until one day she learns that her doctor is wrong. Long-term prescription benzodiazepine use causes all kinds of problems, including profound changes in brain function. While healing from an iatrogenic brain injury, Renée had to unlearn a lot of bad cultural messaging. She learned to trust her intuition and her body above everything else, and she discovered a new ability, her creativity, which has turned into her greatest strength, led to confidence, and brought her to her current beautiful and fulfilling life chapter. Nearly 9 years after her injury, Renée's brain is mostly healed. Today, she is an independent artist whose paintings hang in private collections throughout the world. In addition to painting and teaching art classes, Renée is also a certified peer recovery advocate, offering emotional support to individuals who have withdrawal from their psychiatric medications. Renée has written the book Psychiatrized-Waking Up After a Decade of Bad Medicine, which is also available as an audiobook. Her home and studio are in Rochester, New York. Links for Renée, her book, and our hosts are in the show notes.
Welcome, listeners, to Once Shattered, Picking Up the Pieces. Today, our episode is Psychiatrized, Waking Up After a Decade of Bad Medicine with Renée Schuls-Jacobson. Renée will be joining us in just a minute, but first I'd like to introduce my co-host, my husband, my soulmate and best friend forever, Jack Major.
Glad to be here as always, and listeners, glad that you're with us today too. Thanks for coming back.
And a warm welcome to our dear friend and fellow advocate and fun personality, Ellen Bennett.
Hello, hello. So great to be here, and I'm so excited because Renee's right here with us. She's in person. Welcome.
Well, Renée will be introduced in just a second, but I always like to start with a quote, and I feel this one is very pertinent to this special interview with Renée. Learning is the beginning of wealth. Learning is the beginning of health. Learning is the beginning of spirituality. Searching and learning is where the miracle process all begins. By Jim Rohn. What do you guys think, Ellen, Jack?
Couldn't say it better myself. Yeah, that's very poignant quote that I think we learn more as we get older, and understand what the real important things are.
I love that it kind of puts that focus back on learning in terms of it's innate within us, and we embrace it and how it enriches us throughout our lifetime.
Well, in addition to the talents we just listened to in Renée's bio, she has also helped others birth their books, and she helped us do that with our book, Emily. And I want to extend a nice, warm welcome to our dear friend, Renée. Welcome, Renée.
Welcome, Renée.
Hello and good morning.
Hi, guys. I'm so honored to be here. This is just truly, I'm in a room with my most favorite people. So thank you for having me.
Well, we're thrilled you're here.
In your beautiful memoir, Psychiatrized, Waking Up After a Decade of Bad Medicine, you share some things that happened during the birth of your son. Both you and your husband and the baby experienced a scary and very traumatic time, which no one had anticipated. Do you think the anxiety and the inability to sleep afterwards were the catalyst to bring earlier traumas to the surface, and no one was prepared to listen? Your book is incredible. Every emotion is brought forth in your book. Okay, now I'll get back on track. I have to say, as a reader, I could feel your confusion and uncertainty. Did anyone suggest a therapist or a mental health counselor might be able to help?
So let me take the first part of that question first, where you asked if I thought the trauma of my labor and delivery and the birth of my son was a catalyst to bring earlier traumas to the surface. I'm going to give you a yes and no answer. The yes part is that I had definitely had many traumas that had happened earlier in my life. But at the time, I did not realize what was happening to me. So I'm going to go back for a minute just to say that we all live through different levels of trauma in our lives, which, and I had plenty of that growing up. So growing up in a conservative Jewish family, I had internalized a lot of unspoken expectations very young. We don't question these things when we're young. We just kind of internalize them. And there were a lot of rules. And frankly, some of the things I learned at public school were not matching up with what I was learning in religious school. So for an example, I would go to regular school, and by day, my teachers were wanting to hear my opinions. We would read a book and they would want us to say what we thought about the book and what we felt about the book. And we had to find some textual support. And then I would go to religious school after school, and we would learn something, and I would have a question or an opinion about that. And so, for example, one day, one of my favorite stories, I had learned somewhere that belly buttons were the place where babies were attached to their mothers. And so it occurred to me then in religious school, synthesizing of the information, it occurred to me that Adam did not have a mother to whom he was attached, and that Eve was of man born, came from his rib. So I raised my hand and asked my Hebrew school teacher, a rabbi, do you think Adam and Eve had belly buttons? And I really meant it as like a sincere question, but this was not received with any kind of curiosity or appreciation. I was considered disrespectful, unruly, and immediately disciplined and sent to the office. And this was very common for me. I was very inquisitive. I thought it was a good question. And I was chastised and sent out. And that repeated over and over again. And so I would call that little t trauma, right? Like every time you open your mouth to ask a question, and if somebody starts to say, shut your pisk, then you learn to be quiet. And so that's just early stuff that I went through. Then there was other messaging, right? Like I was taught that it was supposed to be my job as a woman, that I would be one day married, and that it would be my job to be the wind beneath my husband's wings. I would be cooking for him. I would be cleaning for him. We would have children, and it would be my job to raise those children and care for his children. And there really wasn't much emphasis on me or my own strengths, my own desires, my own interests, my own career aspirations. And I never questioned that. It was just these were the kinds of the relationships I saw around me. My mother was not a particular warm or nurturing person. And in fact, she could be quite cruel at times and punitive, screaming and belittling me. And it was very confusing. She would treat me pretty terribly. And then my father would come home from work and I would tell him what had transpired. And she was like a different person. She was sing-songy and soft, and she had made a lovely dinner and say, well, none of those things happened. Your daughter is not telling the truth. And it was my first experience, I guess, with like gaslighting, right? Which we, I think culturally we all understand that concept now is when you have an experience, then someone tries to tell you that your experience could not be what you actually in fact experienced. And so when you experience that kind of thing early, it is very confusing and you're susceptible to not trusting your own reality and your own sensory experience. And so that's the kind of thing that piles up over time. It's complicated and it's it just, we stew in it. So I would also just say that, like I said, everyone goes through difficult times in their lives. But by the time I was 19 years old, I had lived through a home invasion and also suffered some pretty significant sexual trauma in my life. And after both of these events, everyone assumed I was okay and that I should simply just brush myself off, pull myself up by the bootstraps and keep going. And I would say that after the home invasion, the house was a wreck. It had been completely vandalized. There was fluffernutter smeared on the walls. Like, I really remember every detail. They had touched everything. Everything was, I couldn't believe how much of a mess could be made in such a short amount of time. And I was hiding and I just remember being terrified and worried that these people would come back, and my father tried to reassure me. He said, we'll change the locks. We're cleaning everything up. And we did those things. But the fear kind of still lingered in there about being alone in the house, staying by myself. And same kind of thing after the rape. I tried to tell people what had happened, that I was upset by what had happened. And it was like they didn't hear me. It was like they didn't hear me. And the person with whom that occurred was someone that I had liked. It was someone that I knew and trusted. And it felt like an incredible betrayal. And my friends knew that I liked and trusted this person. And they just couldn't really take in what I was saying. They would say, "Oh, it's so great. You guys had sex. It's so great." And I was like, "But it wasn't good." And they tried to tell me it's never good the first time. And I'm like, "You guys, it was not okay. Like, it was not good." So I didn't feel like people were hearing me. And then, of course, I had to go home and tell my mother what had happened, because it's not like in a situation like that he had stopped to put on protection or anything. I was afraid that I could be pregnant, and I was supposed to be going to college 2 weeks later, and I ended up telling my mother. And when I told her, it's like right out of the stereotypical handbook or whatever, she shamed me and blamed me. She said, "What were you wearing? Why were you alone with him? Why? You must have done something to cause this. And you're ruined by the religion, the religious upbringing. I was supposed to be a virgin. I was supposed to be chaste. And she told me that no one was ever going to love me, that I was damaged goods, and that I should never tell anyone about this." So it was really heavy stuff. And, I ended up having to go get a pregnancy test, and it was the 80s. So, I was afraid, everyone was afraid I could have had AIDS. And, but, went to the doctor. I wasn't pregnant. The AIDS test was negative. And because there weren't any external wounds to see, everyone just kind of assumed I was fine. And in reality, I was not fine at all. But I didn't have the words to say what I was feeling, and I knew I needed to go to school, to college. And so I just kept going. And I think a lot of us do that. And we just kind of keep going, and we look at each other and think that person looks fine. They seem to have it all together, when in fact, we may not be fine. When I got to college, my coping mechanisms involved a lot of like staying busy, busyness, workaholism. And of course, our culture loves workaholism. It's highly rewarded. And I didn't really make many friends or join clubs. I was afraid of boys. You can understand why. And I was afraid of beer. There was some alcohol involved in what had happened with me in the rape situation. And so I avoided fraternity parties and just kind of stayed in to study. And so I did that. And you know what? After 4 years of college, I graduated Phi Beta Kappa and cum laude, and everyone patted me on the back and said, "You're amazing." And so, I just kept going, and I went to graduate school, and I was a good girl. I tried to do everything in the right order, and I was still on my track. And I guess what I would say is that I had no self-awareness of any of this at the time. And so when you asked that question earlier about was this the rise to this trauma, it wasn't until my son's difficult labor and delivery for my son, where I lost 75% of my blood, and I had a near-death experience in the hospital, that I started to have some really troubling somatic symptoms arise. And, I just want to take a step back for a minute and say that I truly believe that everybody has sort of inside of them a cup, an invisible cup that gets filled with our trauma. And, some people might have a big gulp size cup and some people might have a shot glass size cup. And maybe that's genetics, that's what we get. And maybe some people can really pack that stuff down tightly. And I guess at that point, when my son was born, all those years later, all of a sudden there comes a point when you push everything down into that cup. Suddenly you try to add another drop of trauma in there and it's not going in the cup anymore. Now the cup is overflowing. And so that's kind of the framework that I think about this, was that when my son was born, I had all these somatic symptoms. I was having auditory hallucinations, visual hallucinations, the insomnia that you mentioned. And everyone just kind of normalized it. Everyone was like, well, when you have a baby, you're so tired. Of course you're tired. And I was trying to tell people this was next level. Like I wasn't sleeping at all. And I was crying and alternately angry and lashing out. And it was a very scary situation for my husband at the time, both of us, because I felt pretty out of control. And he's a doctor. And so he started to become increasingly concerned and suggested that I should go see my primary care physician, who immediately said, this is postpartum depression. And it's very common. And that all I really needed was some pills. And so, I was married to a doctor. I was part of a very medical community and a medical family. And so I tried SSRI after SSRI. And, I had a lot of faith in that process.
So you share your experience with medications and with benzodiazepines, which are used to reduce anxiety, promote sleep, and they're sometimes used to prevent seizures, and less frequently they're prescribed as a muscle relaxant. Can you tell us why you were prescribed this medication? And I think you just did. Mm-hmm. And what were you told about it? And what else? Was there more going on at your life in that time?
Yeah. So I just want to back up a little and say that this was before I even started the benzodiazepines, because that's not typically the first medication someone will give you. And so I was on the path to being polydrugged. And so, but I had so much faith in Western medicine and in this paradigm that I had, everyone said, if you're not feeling well, you go to see your doctor. That's what we do. We still say that. You don't feel good? Oh, you should go see the doctor. And so I trusted my doctor and I tried these medications, and each one made me feel worse and worse. One would rev me up. One made it so I thought I had insomnia before, but now I really wasn't sleeping. And then I started to have some ticking and my eyes were twitching. And so finally, after the quote unquote, my doctor told me I had failed. He actually used the words, I had failed 3 SSRIs and now we needed to bring out the big guns. He sent me to a psychiatrist who within 15 minutes told me that he knew exactly what my problem was. I had anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, and that I was in luck, that there was a magical pill, and that he knew it was going to just solve everything for me. And that is when I was given my very first dose, 0.25 milligrams of clonazepam. He told me it was a baby dose with no known side effects and that it was completely safe. He used the words tried and true and said it was a good drug that had been around for decades. And I was like, well, why the heck hasn't anyone ever mentioned this before? And the reality is it worked. I took that medication and it worked.
Okay. So they started you on this 0.25 milligrams of clonazepam. So this whole class of drugs was developed in the 1950s. And I became a pharmacist in 1975, got out of pharmacy school in 1975. And that's when they became a controlled substance. A controlled substance means that doctors can only write a certain quantity with so many refills, and they're supposed to check with the patient before they give them more. But from my perspective as a pharmacist for the last 40 plus years, I've seen these drugs help some people, and I've seen others who are sensitive to them and can't stay on them. And I've seen a lot of people who abuse them, take them too often, always needed early refills, and got higher dosing. So short-term use is usually safe and effective, but the long-term use can lead to tolerance and dependence on them, as everyone knows. And as you know, these medications cannot be stopped cold turkey, meaning just one day you're taking them and the next day you stop. Wean yourself off. So the weaning process is different for all individuals, and for some can take a very, very long time. So what was your experience with this?
Yeah. So I actually just want to go back to something that you said, which is in your experience, you saw some people who were helped by these drugs. And I guess I question that at this point, because at this point I've spoken to hundreds and hundreds of people who have been injured, and I don't disagree with you that these drugs have a function in an acute situation, in a hospital setting prior to a surgery. But I question how these, when people say that, they're helpful, I do question what that actually means, like what your idea of help is. And like you said, short term, I don't have a problem with that. But the as of 2020, the new FDA regulations, they have been changed, and they even acknowledge that these medications, these drugs, should not be written for more than 2 weeks. And I don't know, that's pretty short term use to prior to that, there was no acknowledgement that, that it really needed to be. There was like a 4 week, and they've reduced it to 2 weeks because people are becoming dependent so quickly.
Yeah. And that came along with the opioid, changes and prescribing of those too. And, they're not supposed to be prescribed together.
Correct.
It's very, very, very dangerous.
Correct. So when you asked about, also when you mentioned about not stopping cold turkey, so there's a lot of confusion in the medical community about what it means to taper someone off of these drugs. Some doctors, and in fact, I've spoken to hundreds of people at this point who have told me their doctor did taper them off. They told them that they should cut it in half, and then they should cut it in half again 2 weeks later. And that is considered a successful taper. Well, they tapered them, right? Mm-hmm. But these drugs are very powerful. And as I mentioned, I was taking 0.25 milligrams of clonazepam, or Klonopin as it's called. And that is 20 times stronger than Valium. It's really important for people to understand that, because when you tell someone you're taking 0.25 milligrams of something, it sounds minute. It sounds so tiny. And that is very intentional and very strategic way of marketing a medication. We knew back in the 60s that Valium was, the Stones, the Rolling Stones were calling that mother's little helper. Right. There were long stories about people being ruined by Valium, but they continued to bring out next generation medications, the Ativan, the what are the other ones? Xanax, exactly. Same drugs, just different names and more powerful.
Shorter duration.
Yeah, right.
Clearing the body.
Very powerful, but they sound like nothing. 0.25 milligrams. It's micro dose. So in my experience, I actually was very fortunate to land in pretty good hands. There is a doctor here in Rochester. Her name is Patricia Halligan, and she actually is one of the very few doctors, psychiatrists, who is considered benzo-wise. She had seen this phenomenon with people who had been taking benzodiazepines exactly as prescribed long-term and started to experience problematic side effects. And so she said to me that she could help me to get off of this medication, but it was going to take a long time. And so my taper was medically supervised. It was 10 months. And during that time, I came off of what was then I had gone up over the years, over a 7-year period, up to 2.5 milligrams. And she helped me to get down from 2.5 as low as I possibly could on the clonazepam. And then per the Ashton manual, which is a manual that a person named Dr. Heather Ashton created, and you can find it online, she created a protocol to help people cross over from the clonazepam to Valium and then continue tapering down. And so we did that over that 10-month period. And it was at the end of that period where things got a little bit wonky. Dr. Halligan needed to go on vacation. You know, everyone's entitled to take their time away. She's a very conscientious person. And she told me that she was going on vacation. And she asked me if I understood what I was doing with my taper. And I really thought that I did. She always gave me this yellow legal pad, which had my instructions on it. And it said, 0.125 milligrams Valium. And then that was the bottom of the sheet. That was the end of the sheet. There was nothing behind it. And so I made that cut while she was away. And that was it. That was all I knew. That was as low as you could really cut those little suckers down, at least as far as I knew. So I had like a victory dance. I went out and bought a dress and I was like, woohoo, I'm off of this stuff. 10 months later, success. What I didn't know was that she had intended for me to continue tapering using a water titration so that I could have gone lower and lower and lower until I was eventually at 0.0 milligrams. But we hadn't had that conversation. I didn't really know. I certainly wasn't in touch with any kind of a apothecary or anything like that. There were no plans in place. So I just stopped. So when you mention the words cold turkey, within the benzodiazepine harmed community, we consider that a cold turkey because I did abruptly stop at still 0.125 milligrams of Valium, but it was thank goodness it was down so low. Can you imagine what it's like for people who are abruptly stopped at 2 and 4 and 6 milligrams of clonazepam, which is 20 times stronger than my tiny little dose then of the Valium. That's how powerful these drugs are. So once I got off the medication, these drugs are long lasting. They stay a long time in your system. So about 7 to 10 days after I stopped taking the medication, I started to feel unwell. The first thing I noticed was a problem with my eyes. My eyes started watering. It was like, I called it leaking. They were just pouring tears. And my vision felt like someone had smeared Vaseline over my eyes and everything seemed really bright. And, my ex-husband was an ophthalmologist. And so he brought me into the office and he was like doing all kinds of testing. He's like, maybe you have a detachment, or maybe you have sojourns, or he was testing me for all different kinds of medical stuff. And he's like, nothing, everything looked perfectly fine. And then as the days went by, I started to develop what I called kaleidoscope vision. So it looked like the world was sort of pixelated. Like, have you ever watched a television and it has some of those weird little it's like the TV's broken and it's like annoying. So I had that in my field of vision. And again, my ex-husband was like, well, maybe it's an ocular migraine, it's something neurological. So he shot me with some Imitrex. I got some Imitrex and I took some Imitrex and that didn't help. And as time went by, things started to get worse. The insomnia had come back. The audio hallucinations returned. I was hearing voices. I had muscle spasms. It was really scary. And finally, what ended up happening was one day I was standing in the kitchen and I was trying to impress upon him how serious this was. And it was hearkening back to those earlier traumas that Ellen asked about earlier, where I was trying so hard to tell him that something wasn't right, just the way I had previously when I told my parents or when I told my friends or all those times, and everyone said, you're fine, you're fine. And I tried to tell him things were not right. And all of a sudden I heard a sound in my brain. I can still hear it. It was 3 clicks. It just went click, click, click. The kind of sound that your thermostat would make, like when you click it off or on kind of thing. And I heard it. And the next thing I knew, I was down. My knees buckled. I was on the ground. At the time, I had full consciousness. I did not understand what was happening. But now I understand that was seizure. I was having a seizure. even when I talk about it, it's surreal to me. I had a seizure and my husband looked at me. He accused me of being dramatic and he stepped over me and went to work for the day. And it was really upsetting because it was, as I laid there, that was the first moment that I went back in my mind and I went, oh, this has happened to me before. Not a seizure, but where something was happening in front of them, in me, that was not received. They did not see it. They minimized it. And I started to, it's weird, lying there on the ground, I started to connect the dots. And that is because, FYI, these medications have a powerful amnesiatic effect. When you take them long time, they impact your normal cognitive function. You don't dream. That's when your nighttime mind is trying to make sense of things happening in the day. It just blacks you out. The same way as if my doctor had told me, here's a bottle of Jack Daniels and told me to drink that until I would fall asleep at night, I would have looked at the guy and questioned. But because I trusted my doctor, I did exactly what he said for 7 years. And then coming off of the medication, all of that stuff starts to come up.
Okay, listeners, you're getting a sense of what reading Renee's book is like. You're captivated, you're pulled in. But I got to ask you the question. You use the term iatrogenic brain injury. New term to me. Will you explain and how you felt your life began to fall apart?
For sure. So I didn't know this term initially. This is something that I've learned many years after this experience, but iatrogenic really just means a medically caused injury. So, if you go into surgery and the doctor removes the wrong organ, that's an iatrogenic injury. And so what basically had happened to me was that I had been prescribed a medication, and this injury was, people want to say that, call you like a drug addict, that you're drug seeking, or that's because I was taking drugs. But the real thing that's happening here is that my body adapted to the medication and it caused neurological changes, which is a form of an injury. When you stop the medication, I always think of it as like in the Little Shop of Horrors, there was that plant that went like, feed me, Seymour. And that's like what your body says when you stop taking the medication. It's like, what is happening? Feed me. And because I didn't, your brain is wired for it. It wants it. And so that is a form of an injury. And then because I think also that I had the seizures, I don't even know what that did to me neurologically. So it was very complicated. And yes, my life did begin to fall apart. Prior to that, I had been a teacher. I had been an educator for decades. And I couldn't teach. I couldn't read. I couldn't write. I couldn't walk. I couldn't talk. Weird symptoms. I was afraid of taking a shower. That is rando. That's random, but it's very common. People call that hydrophobia. I developed all kinds of weird paranoid thinking. And the brain is our it's like a computer, right? And it had short circuited. And so I was at its mercy, and it was very, very scary.
Wow. Well, trauma, illness, grief affect us at our core, and those things change us on many levels. I believe that true, deep, and somatic healing takes place within us mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And we heal, hopefully we learn and we grow. Many times there are people that show up and help guide us down a new and spiritual path. I believe that happened for you. Can you tell us about meeting one of those people? I know one of them was Dr. Halligan, but can you tell us about your other angel in the Center of Grace and about the different healing modalities you explored?
So crazy story is that one day I basically had decided I had had enough. I had decided I wasn't going to make it. So trigger warning, I guess I would say, I had pretty much decided I was going to complete suicide. And I was leaning against a building and crying and just being really sad that I was going to have to end it. And a woman approached me, and she came up to me and she said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "No, I am not okay. I'm not okay at all." I told her briefly what had happened to me, what I was planning to do. And she kind of cocked her head and she said, do you want to come home with me? I did not hesitate. I didn't know her name. I didn't know where she lived. But when you get to that low and you decide it's over, all right, take me home with you. Go ahead. Put me in your basement torture chamber, lady. Make it snappy. And, as it turned out, I could not have landed in better hands. The woman's name was, it was weird. We shared the same name. Her name is also Renee McLean. She lived in just outside of Syracuse, New York. And as it turned out, she had been through something similar herself. So here was someone telling me that she had been through something similar, that she had come out the other side, and that she offered me this hope that I could heal too. She knew all about the importance of eating clean. She taught me about juicing. She taught me about resting. I didn't know how to rest. I had been running for years. She taught me how to take care of myself. We practiced meditation. I didn't know about any of these things. And those were just some of the early things that she taught me. But she also showed me this love and compassion that I really had not experienced before. And to think that it was coming from a complete stranger outside of my family system was stunning to me, stunning. And in the years since, what I would say to you is, or I guess let me just tell you what happened to me quickly while I was there. Renee was never alarmed by any of the things that I said or did. And while I was there, I had a very profound experience where it was like neither a dream nor I was both awake and asleep. And basically I had a visitation. To this day, I believe I was visited by an angel. And this angel, it was so clear. He was super duper tall and hovering over me. And I heard that weird like om sound in the background. And it was not male or female. It's kind of both at the same time. And the angel said to me, "Listen to the voice of the Creator and you will never be led astray." And then he or she also said to me, "You're going to heal. It's just going to take a long time. Be patient." And I don't know how to explain that. It was the most profound experience of my entire life. It changed me in that moment. I felt I had been given a message from the other side. And I told Renee about it, and she did not say, "You're crazy." She did not say, "Quiet down, go to the office." She didn't reprimand me. She said, "I believe you. And that's really beautiful. And let's tap into that." And it was like everything changed there because she had also had that kind of experience. And she told me that many, many, many people have had that kind of a spiritual experience where you're in touch, tap into something from the beyond. And what I didn't know at the time about Renee was that she was wanted to open something called, she wanted to open a healing facility herself. And I was not the first stray she had taken in. Her family was very used to her bringing people in and helping them to get through difficult life circumstances. And she was basically wanting to persuade her husband that she knew what she was doing so that they could begin to do this formally. And so in the years since that I stayed with her, she opened up a place called the Center of Grace. It's in Manlius, New York. And it is a place where people can have circles, women's circles, men's circles. They offer meditation. They offer somatic respiratory integration, basically anything that you need to help to support you when you're going through a difficult time. How much do I wish that somebody had sent me to a place like that way back before I ended up going down the psychiatric route.
Absolutely.
Well, God bless Renee. What was the last name?
McLean.
McLean. Oh, gosh, because you're here today.
Yeah, I wouldn't have been, for real.
So art therapy is a growing field that helps people express themselves and create art and help them heal. And I know that the first time we met you, Linda met you at an art craft show. And you're a very, very successful artist. And so you can tell us how that happened?
Yeah. So while I was at Renee's house, as she was telling me to tap into that weird experience, I started to have dreams. My dreams came back. They had been suppressed for so long. And I started to see in full color these images of hearts and words and girls and I just saw these things. They were so powerful. And she suggested to me that I maybe should start to try to paint these things. And so at the beginning, they were just really simple. I call it my primitive stage. I was making hearts and putting just some simple words with them. And stunningly, I would post it on Facebook and people were like, I really like that. Can I buy that from you? And it was a real shocker because I was still very impaired and I was worried. How am I going to have a livelihood? I couldn't teach. I couldn't read. I couldn't leave the house for an extended period of time without really terrible, scary symptoms and becoming terribly fatigued. And suddenly I'm doing this thing that's effortless and people are saying they liked it and that they're willing to pay for it. And so, I sold the first couple the first paintings I didn't even sell. I just said, how about you come over and visit me and I'll give you something. But then over time, people said, well, at least, let me pay you so that you could buy more art supplies. And as time went on and I continued to move through the healing process, this was something that I found that I could do that made the time pass. Because when you are in excruciating pain for hours upon hours on end, you're living in an invisible torture chamber, it's not having something to do that is just the hours roll out before you, and finding this thing that I could do that made the time pass was like magic. I could draw a painting and 3 hours would go by. Oh my God, I made the day kind of move. And the fact that people liked it and it reinforced itself. So what I've learned since then is that, and I didn't know it at the time, but I was basically doing art therapy on myself. I was just making pretty pictures. But we do know, and that the science seems to support this now, is that what that does, any creative endeavor where you're using both hands and movement, is helps to develop new neural pathways, and it is the path to healing. I don't care if you're hooking rugs, playing with clay, gardening, baking cookies, something that helps you to stay in the movement and that you can find some kind of pleasure in, that other people can be tapped into as well. It is amazing.
They say that when you tap into the power of creation, it's the most powerful vibration right up there next to love. So it's the spirit that we were created in. So I think that resonates with me very powerfully. We're running out of time really quickly here. Ellen, I think you had another question you wanted to ask.
Okay. This book is an incredible read. Renee, thank you. You bring so many things to life. And I acknowledge the pain that you went through for so many years. But as you describe your healing, it has such a profound effect. There may be no quick answers. Our mental and physical health is very complex. Once again, your book made me realize how we must be involved in our own health. Do you have any thoughts on this?
I do. Just briefly, I would say that you just tapped into it. You said our mental and physical health is so complex. We are complicated organisms. I don't know, somewhere along the line, someone thought we were really simple. And that we're like, we are very complex. It's a complicated system. And I do think that we've been taught to rely a little too heavily on Western medicine, which seeks to minimize things like this. And our country is a new country, right? Like what are we, 250 years old or something like that? I don't know how old we are.
Yeah.
And how old are we, like, with our Independence Day, July 4th, 76, whatever. We're like 250 years old. We're kind of like bratty little teenagers. Like, we know what's best for us. You can't tell us what to do. But the reality is there are other cultures that are older that do have sensibilities that, and knowledge that we need to tap into and are now. And so these cultures know how to slow the mind, how to handle distress. And we have just been like wanting quick fixes. And so I think that in reality, healing of all kinds, both physically and emotionally, takes a lot more time than we really want to acknowledge. Like if you rip into your arm and you hurt yourself, you can watch the healing on the surface and you might have a scar. And that takes time. But an emotional scar, it takes 10 times. I remember people always saying, sticks and stones may break no bones, but words can never hurt me. Lies. Lies. Words
they have power.
Right. They really do. And those create invisible wounds that take a long time to unlearn. And in fact, at the very beginning of this, Linda, I think, read that quote you were all talking about how learning is the beginning of wealth. I would say unlearning is what this journey has been about for me, unlearning some of that messaging.
Well, it's both. It's learning and unlearning.
Right, unlearning and new learning. But new learning is so hard to take in and integrate.
Well, I think the thing is that people have to be open. Yes. I mean, you have to always keep an open mind. If you don't agree with something, if people don't agree with what you're saying now, it will resonate with other people, and everybody's different. Absolutely. But it's such an important message.
And
anyway,
we're taught to trust the doctors. Like you said, if something's wrong, you go to a doctor. But if you get a feeling and you know your body and you know your mind better than the doctor does, and get a second opinion. Don't
and a third
if you need to. So, but
it's always good to question.
Right.
Doctors are human too, and a lot of times doctors need to collaborate. Sometimes they don't have all the answers. But I do think that it's beginning to change.
I agree.
It's beginning to change.
Yes,
but we've always been a society of a pill for every ill. And, maybe you can help me. Years ago, I was going to write a book called The Gumball Machine, where you have a machine, put a quarter in, you turn, and all these drugs fall out into your hands. And that's starting to change, and slowly, but...
and I don't want to make it sound like I'm anti-medication, right? Because look, medicine works.
Right.
It does. And these medicines can be used in proper context. I guess I just want to see patients, consumers, be given real knowledge about what they could potentially be taking, so they have full informed consent, not be, you need to know what you're entering into. Just the same way before you take a surgery, you have to sign all kinds of papers so that you understand that there could be all kinds of effects. Same thing before you put something into your body.
Well, and healing is mental, emotional, and physical. Yeah. I mean, that's where healing takes place on all those and spiritual. Absolutely. It's all those things. So this has gone by so quickly. And it's really hard to share such a personal journey, Renee, and I commend you for doing that. We all do, and we understand how hard that is, having done that ourselves. You have shared your story, and people have reached out to you, and you are hope for them, and that is a gift, because you have your own community now who you've helped, who've had a similar experience coming off of this class of medications. Is there anything more you'd quickly like to share with us, and where can people find you, your artwork, and your beautiful book?
Thank you so much. Well, I do want to just add that, like Jack just said, I really believe we are in the midst of a paradigm shift. There was a time, not so very long ago, around Christopher Columbus's time, where we really thought the world was flat, and that the scholars and the experts of the time thought you could sail off the edge of the world and fall off. They were terrified. They believed this. But we know that that is not true now. And just like Linda said, we have to stay open to the idea that there is new information coming all the time. And so I believe that there is going to be a day when the next generation is going to look back at the way we gumballized medication, right? Where we handed out these drugs so easily. And they're going to look back and say, they did what? Why did they think that they should numb pain? Why didn't they know how to use this or that? Why didn't they know about breath work or, all these other tools? Why didn't they have those tools in their tool belt? I really believe that we're heading in that direction. And so I guess I would just say, I really believe that we are all stronger than we think we are. And that we, with some improved coping skills, and reconnection to one another, and by trusting our own intuition, that we have everything that we actually need to support each other and love each other through our most challenging times. That psychiatry, maybe while it means well, is maybe a branch of the medical tree that needs to be pruned back a bit. And unfortunately, tens of thousands of people have been harmed in the same way that I was. And I just really want people to know and hold on to my story and know that it's going to be 9 years, August 1st, that I'm off of this medication. And I consider myself in good health now. I am back to being well physically, emotionally, spiritually, all those things. And I believe that people can and do heal. Just have to wait, be patient, and stay open-minded and go on the journey.
Beautiful. And where can people
Oh, thank
find
you. Yes, I always forget that part. So as you mentioned earlier, I do offer emotional support to people coming through these injuries. And I also sell my art and blah, blah, that kind of stuff. So the best way to find me is on my website, which is www.razjacobson.store. And I have a little contact page where people can find me. And if you don't mind, I sing a little song because then it can make a little earworm in for people. I always say, I'm always making something. I'm an artist to the core. razjacobson.store. There. Now you'll have that in your head all day. But that's where people can find me.
RAS, Raz,
yes,
right?
Yes, RASJACOBSON.store. Just Google me. You can find me.
Yeah. Well, Renee, this has been wonderful. I knew it would be, and it's been a joy all these 5 years and going forward. So thank you to our listeners. We hope you enjoyed today's show. You are the best. Please help us get the word out about One Shattered Picking Up the Pieces, because everyone's health matters. We all know somebody who's
Everyone's
struggling.
mental health matters too.
Mental health matters, sorry. Tell your friends, share this podcast, rate and review it on the platform you're listening to us on. And the audio of this podcast is also now available on YouTube and iHeart.
Thank you, Rockbox Recording and Production and Sound Engineer and Producer Scott Fitzgerald. For expertly producing our podcast and so much more. This is the place to record your podcast, record your audiobook, or do a legacy cast for your loved ones. Thank you, everyone, for listening.